On July 2, 1992, air traffic controllers at Caracas International Airport in Venezuela detected an unscheduled aircraft on final approach. The transponder signal was faint, outdated in format, and carried no flight plan on record. When the tower made contact, the pilot identified his aircraft as Pan American Flight 914, a Douglas DC-4 en route from New York to Miami. He requested priority landing clearance due to low fuel. The controller asked him to confirm his point of departure and estimated time en route. The pilot replied that he had departed New York earlier that morning. The date he gave was July 2nd, 1955. 37 years earlier, on the morning of July 2nd, 1955, Pan American Flight 914 had pushed back from its gate at New York International Airport, later known as John F. Kennedy International, bound for Miami International. The flight was a scheduled domestic service, routine in every respect. It carried 57 passengers and a crew of 4. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-4, registration number N8899, a proven workhorse of post-war commercial aviation. The DC-4 had been in continuous service since 1946, with a clean maintenance record and no outstanding airworthiness directives. Its 4 Pratt & Whitney radial engines had been overhauled within the previous 200 flight hours. Total airframe time stood at 18,000 hours. The captain was Edward Burkhart, age 41, with just over 9,000 hours of flight time, including 2,200 hours on type. His first officer was Robert Finch, age 33, with 6,100 hours total time and 1,400 on the DC-4. Both men were instrument rated, held current medical certificates, and had passed their most recent proficiency checks without discrepancy. The flight attendants were trained according to Civil Aeronautics Administration standards, and the passenger manifest had been filed with operations prior to departure. Everything about Flight 914 was procedurally sound. The planned route was direct. Departure from runway 4 right, climb to cruising altitude of 10,000 feet, then southbound along the eastern seaboard with navigation checkpoints over Atlantic City, Norfolk, and Jacksonville before descent into Miami. Forecast weather was clear along the entire route. Winds aloft were light and variable. Visibility exceeded 10 statute miles at all reporting stations. Estimated flight time was 3 hours and 20 minutes. Fuel load was calculated for 4 hours and 40 minutes of flight, including reserves as required by regulation. At 9:42 local time, Flight 914 received clearance for takeoff. The tower controller noted the departure in his log. The flight lifted off without incident and established a climb on the assigned heading. At 9:47, the aircraft checked in with New York Center on the designated frequency. The first officer acknowledged the assigned altitude and confirmed the aircraft was squawking the correct transponder code. Communication was clear. The controller confirmed radar contact and issued an instruction to continue on course. The first officer read back the clearance. It was the last transmission received from Flight 914. At 9:51, the radar return began to weaken. The controller called the flight to confirm altitude and heading. There was no response. He repeated the call twice. Still no response. The transponder signal disappeared from the scope at 9:53. The controller immediately contacted adjacent sectors to determine whether the flight had inadvertently switched frequencies. No other facility had radio or radar contact with the aircraft. At 9:55, New York Center declared a communications emergency and initiated search procedures. The Coast Guard was notified. Flight 914 had been airborne for 13 minutes. Search aircraft were dispatched along the projected flight path. Surface vessels were alerted. Weather stations confirmed that no adverse conditions existed in the area at the time of the disappearance. No distress calls had been transmitted on any frequency. No emergency locator transmitter signals were detected. By noon, an organized search and rescue operation was underway, covering a rectangular area extending from the New Jersey coast to a point 100 miles offshore. No wreckage was sighted, no oil slicks, no debris of any kind. The sea state was calm, visibility unlimited. A DC-4 in distress would have left evidence. None was found. Pan American issued a formal statement on the evening of July 2, 1955. The airline confirmed that Flight 914 was missing and that all pertinent authorities had been notified. Families of passengers and crew were being contacted. The aircraft had been carrying standard emergency equipment, including life rafts and flotation vests. The possibility of a controlled ditching was considered, but no explanation could account for the complete absence of communication prior to any such event. Ditching would require time, altitude, and some form of crew coordination. The flight had been in normal operations at 10,000 feet, in clear weather, with no indication of mechanical failure. The official investigation was conducted by the Civil Aeronautics Board. Investigators reviewed the aircraft's maintenance logs, the crew's training records, the weather data, and all recorded communications. They interviewed personnel at New York Center and confirmed that the radar track had been consistent with normal flight until the signal faded. No anomalous returns had been observed. No other aircraft had reported unusual activity in the vicinity. The conclusion reached by the board was that Flight 914 had experienced an unspecified catastrophic event, resulting in the total loss of the aircraft and all persons aboard. The absence of wreckage was noted, but not explained. The case was classified as an unexplained accident. It remained open but inactive. For 37 years, Pan American Flight 914 existed in official records only as a closed chapter of aviation history. The families of those aboard received settlement payments. Memorial services were held. The aircraft registration was retired. In the archives of the Civil Aeronautics Board, and later the Federal Aviation Administration, the file gathered dust among thousands of others. No one expected the case to be reopened. No one anticipated that the story was incomplete. On the morning of July 2nd, 1992, at Caracas International Airport, the control tower was operating under normal conditions. Traffic volume was moderate, visibility was good. At approximately 10:35 local time, a radar technician noticed an unidentified target on approach from the northeast. The transponder code was not recognized by the system. The format of the signal was consistent with equipment that had been obsolete for more than 2 decades. The tower supervisor instructed the controller to make contact. The response was immediate and clear. The pilot identified his aircraft as Pan American Flight 914, outbound from New York to Miami. The controller asked the pilot to confirm his departure point and flight number. The pilot repeated the information. He stated that he had departed New York at 9:42 Eastern Time that morning and was now experiencing fuel concerns. He requested priority landing clearance. The controller noted the time discrepancy, but assumed the pilot had misspoken or was referencing a time zone error. He granted landing clearance and assigned runway 28. The aircraft was instructed to continue its approach and report visual contact with the field. At 10:39, The DC-4 became visually identifiable to personnel on the ground. It was a four-engine propeller aircraft with the livery of Pan American World Airways, a livery that had not been used since the mid-1960s. The aircraft configuration, the paint scheme, and the engine nacelle design were all consistent with a DC-4 manufactured in the mid-1940s. Several ground staff remarked on the unusual appearance of the aircraft. One mechanic stated later that he thought it was part of an air show or historical demonstration. Another noted that the engines sounded clean, with no indication of mechanical distress. The aircraft touched down at 10:42. It rolled out normally and exited the runway at the midfield taxiway. Ground control directed it to a remote stand away from the terminal, as the aircraft had no assigned gate and its presence had not been coordinated with airport operations. The pilot acknowledged the instructions and taxied without incident. Once on stand, the engines were shut down. No ground power unit was connected. No jetway was deployed. Airport security and operations personnel approached the aircraft on foot. When the main cabin door was opened, the flight attendants appeared confused but calm. They inquired about the gate assignment and asked why they had been directed to an isolated position. The passengers, upon disembarking, expressed similar confusion. Several asked why the terminal looked different. One passenger commented that the buildings had been renovated since his last visit to Caracas. Another stated that the airfield layout was not as he remembered. None of them appeared distressed. They behaved as though they had just completed a routine flight. Airport personnel escorted the passengers and crew into a holding area within the operations building. No customs or immigration officials were initially present, as the flight had not been pre-cleared or expected. The pilot and first officer were asked to present their flight paperwork. The documents they provided were authentic Pan American operational forms, dated July 2, 1955. The fuel log indicated a departure fuel load consistent with a New York to Miami routing. The flight plan bore the signature of a dispatcher whose name matched employment records from Pan American in 1955. The document was not a forgery. It was a genuine flight plan from that date. The first officer produced his pilot logbook. The entries were consistent with a pilot actively flying in the mid-1950s. The most recent entry was dated July 1, 1955. There were no entries for any date beyond that. His wristwatch, a manual wind mechanical model, displayed a time consistent with the duration of a 3-hour flight from New York. The crew's personal effects included currency dated no later than 1955. Coins in their pockets bore mint marks from 1954 and earlier. The newspapers in the cockpit were editions from July 2, 1955, covering events of that day. Investigators from the Venezuelan Civil Aviation Authority arrived at the airport by early afternoon. They boarded the aircraft and conducted a preliminary inspection. The interior configuration was consistent with a 1950s-era DC-4. The seats were original. The galley equipment was period correct. The cockpit instruments were analog and matched the type certification for that model and year. The aircraft's registration number, N888899, was cross-referenced with United States records. That registration had been assigned to a DC-4 operated by Pan American, reported missing on July 2, 1955. Fuel samples were taken from the aircraft's tanks. Analysis showed the fuel to be of a grade and chemical composition consistent with aviation gasoline used in the 1950s. The octane rating, the additive package, and the absence of modern refining signatures all pointed to fuel that had been refined decades earlier. The quantity remaining in the tanks was minimal. consistent with an aircraft that had flown for approximately 3 hours and 20 minutes. There was no indication that the aircraft had been refueled at any intermediate point. The passengers were interviewed individually. Their testimonies were consistent. Each recalled boarding the flight in New York on the morning of July 2, 1955. They described routine pre-flight procedures, normal takeoff, and an uneventful climb. Most had been reading, sleeping, or conversing during the flight. None reported turbulence, unusual sounds, or any indication of a problem. Several mentioned that the flight seemed shorter than expected, though none could specify why. When asked what year it was, every passenger answered 1955. When informed that the date was July 2, 1992, the responses ranged from disbelief to silence. Medical personnel conducted examinations of the passengers and crew. There were no signs of physical trauma, malnutrition, or exposure. Vital signs were normal. Cognitive function appeared intact. When asked to recall recent events, the passengers provided details consistent with life in 1955. They referenced political leaders, cultural events, and personal circumstances that matched that era. One passenger mentioned planning to attend a film release scheduled for later that summer of 1955. Another discussed a business meeting planned for the following week in Miami. Their memories were coherent and specific. There was no evidence of disorientation beyond the confusion caused by their current surroundings. United States authorities were notified within hours. The Federal Aviation Administration dispatched a team to Caracas. The National Transportation Safety Board opened an inquiry. Pan American, though no longer operating under that name after various mergers and restructurings, was contacted through its successor entities. The aircraft was impounded pending further investigation. The passengers and crew were held under observation, not as detainees, but as participants in an event that had no procedural precedent. Forensic examination of the aircraft continued over the following days. Engineers inspected the engines, the airframe, the control surfaces, and the avionics. Corrosion patterns and wear indicators were analyzed. The results were puzzling. The aircraft showed signs of use consistent with the airframe hours recorded in its logbook, but there was no evidence of long-term exposure to environmental conditions. No oxidation that would be expected from decades of inactivity. No biological growth. No decay of seals, gaskets, or rubber components beyond what would be normal for an aircraft that had been flown regularly and maintained properly up until very recently. The engine oil was drained and tested. Its viscosity, contamination levels, and breakdown products were consistent with oil that had been in service for approximately 20 to 30 flight hours. The tires showed tread wear consistent with a normally operated aircraft. The brake pads had measurable remaining thickness. The hydraulic fluid was clean. The aircraft appeared to have been in active, continuous use, not in storage or disuse for any significant period. The avionics were of particular interest. The radio equipment was a type that had been standard in the early 1950s, but had been phased out by the early 1960s. The transponder was a Mode A unit, a technology that had been superseded by Mode C in the late 1960s and Mode S in the 1980s. The identification signal transmitted by the transponder matched the code assigned to Flight 914 on July 2, 1955. That code had been deactivated in the FAA database in 1956, following the presumed loss of the aircraft. Yet the signal received by Caracas radar was authentic and functional, transmitting from equipment that had not been in operational use for more than 30 years. Flight data recorders, commonly known as black boxes, were not mandatory on commercial aircraft in 1955. The DC-4 carried no such device. The absence of recorded flight data meant that the only evidence of the flight's path and duration came from the crew's account, the fuel consumption, and the navigation logs. The first officer's navigation chart showed position plots consistent with the direct flight from New York toward Miami. The final plot, marked at approximately 10:30 local time, placed the aircraft over the Caribbean, northeast of the Venezuelan coast. The position was geographically consistent with an aircraft that had continued on its original southbound heading for an additional 7 hours beyond the intended destination. The timeline presented an insoluble problem. Flight 914 had departed New York at 9:42 Eastern Time on July 2, 1955. It had vanished from radar at 9:53 Eastern Time, 13 minutes into the flight. It had reappeared on radar at Caracas at 10:35 local time on July 2, 1992. The crew and passengers believed they had been in the air for approximately 3 hours. The fuel consumption supported a flight time of 3 hours and 20 minutes. But 37 years had passed. Attempts were made to reconcile the data. Investigators considered whether the aircraft had somehow remained aloft for 37 years, but the fuel capacity and consumption rates made this physically impossible. The possibility of a landing at an intermediate location was explored, but no airport or facility reported any contact with the aircraft during the missing years. The aircraft's condition did not support prolonged ground storage. The crew and passengers showed no signs of aging beyond what would be expected during a single day. Medical examinations, including cellular analysis, indicated biological ages consistent with the dates of birth recorded in their 1955 identification documents. The passengers were gradually released from observation. They were provided with temporary documentation and assistance in contacting any surviving relatives. For many, there were none. Families had moved on, believing their loved ones dead for nearly 4 decades. Some relatives were located, now elderly themselves, confronted with the return of a person who had not aged while they had. The psychological impact on both the returned passengers and their families was profound. Social services and psychological support were made available, though the situation fell outside all known frameworks for trauma or displacement. The captain and first officer were debriefed extensively. Both men maintained that they had experienced a normal flight. Captain Burkhart described the departure, the climb, and the en route conditions. He stated that the weather had been clear, the engines had operated normally, and there had been no traffic conflicts. He recalled checking his position at regular intervals and noting that they were on course and on schedule. He remembered the approach into what he believed was Miami, though he acknowledged that the airfield did not match his expectations. When informed of the date, he requested to see a calendar and a newspaper. He read them in silence. He asked to make a phone call. The number he provided had not been in service for 23 years. Robert Finch, the first officer, described a similar experience. He had been handling communications and navigation. He confirmed that the last radio contact he recalled was with New York Center, shortly after departure. He did not remember any interruption in the flight, no loss of consciousness, no indication of systems failure. When asked if he recalled any sensation of time distortion or discontinuity, he stated that the flight had felt entirely routine. He mentioned only that the cockpit clock had seemed to run slightly faster than expected, but attributed this to a minor mechanical variance in the instrument. When shown the cockpit clock after the landing, it displayed a time consistent with a 3-hour flight from New York, despite 37 years having elapsed. The aircraft was eventually transported to the United States under controlled conditions. It was stored at a secure facility and subjected to further analysis. Metallurgical testing was conducted on structural components. Isotope ratios were measured. Paint samples were analyzed for degradation patterns. Carbon dating of organic materials found in the cabin, including fabric and paper, returned results consistent with materials from the 1950s. The aircraft, in every measurable respect, was a 1955-era Douglas DC-4 that had been in active use up to the moment of its arrival in Caracas in 1992. Theoretical explanations were proposed, then systematically dismantled by the evidence. The possibility of an elaborate hoax was considered, but the logistics were insurmountable. The aircraft itself was genuine. The passengers and crew had verifiable identities matching persons reported missing in 1955. Documentation from that era could not have been fabricated with the degree of authenticity observed. The fuel, the materials, the biological evidence all pointed to a genuine temporal discontinuity, yet no physical mechanism existed within known science to account for such an event. Navigation data was reviewed in an attempt to identify any geographic or atmospheric anomaly. The region where Flight 912 disappeared in 1955 off the coast of New Jersey has no unusual magnetic properties. It is not part of the Bermuda Triangle or any other area associated with unexplained disappearances. Weather records from July 2, 1955, confirm clear skies and no atmospheric disturbances. Solar activity on that date was within normal parameters. Cosmic ray flux, geomagnetic field strength, and all other measurable environmental factors were unremarkable. The investigation expanded to include historical records of other aircraft disappearances. Files were cross-referenced to determine whether any other cases presented similar characteristics. Several incidents involved aircraft vanishing without trace, but none involved reappearance. The case of Flight 19, a formation of 5 U.S. Navy torpedo bombers that disappeared off the coast of Florida in 1945, was reviewed. The case of Stardust, a British airliner that vanished in the Andes in 1947 and whose wreckage was not found until 1998, was examined. Neither case offered parallels to the circumstances of Flight 914. Every other missing aircraft eventually yielded wreckage, remains, or at minimum some physical evidence of its fate. Flight 914 had yielded none in 1955 and then yielded the aircraft itself intact and operational in 1992. The official conclusion of the joint investigation released in 1994 was necessarily limited. The report confirmed the identity of the aircraft, the authenticity of the passengers and crew, and the verifiable discrepancy between their experienced timeline and the elapsed calendar time. It documented the physical evidence in exhaustive detail. It acknowledged that no known mechanism could account for the observations. The report refrained from speculation. It did not propose explanations that could not be tested or supported by physical evidence. The final paragraph stated that the case remained open, pending the discovery of additional information or the development of theoretical frameworks capable of addressing the observed facts. Flight 914's passengers were eventually integrated into society as best as possible. Some adapted, learning to navigate a world that had moved forward without them. Others struggled with the dislocation, unable to reconcile their memories with their surroundings. Several required long-term psychological care. A few chose to withdraw from public life entirely, seeking anonymity. Captain Burkhart and First Officer Finch both declined to return to flying. Neither man spoke publicly about the incident beyond their official debriefings. Both passed away in the early 2000s, taking with them any subjective insights they might have had about what occurred during those 13 minutes after departure in 1955. The Douglas DC-4, registration N88899, remains in storage. It has been examined periodically as new analytical techniques have become available. To date, no examination has revealed anything that contradicts the initial findings. The aircraft remains a 1955-era machine, preserved in the condition it held on the day it disappeared. Proposals have been made to place it in a museum, but concerns about public interpretation and the potential for sensationalism have kept it out of public view. It exists now as a piece of evidence without context, a data point that refuses to fit any model. One detail noted in the later reviews of the case has drawn quiet attention among investigators. The cockpit clock, the one that First Officer Finch mentioned as running slightly fast, was removed and examined by horologists. The mechanism showed no defect. It kept time accurately when tested under controlled conditions. But the hands, when the aircraft was secured after landing in Caracas, had been positioned at a time that corresponded not to the duration of the flight as experienced by the crew, but to a time exactly 37 years, 5 hours, and 53 minutes after the moment Flight 914 vanished from radar in 1955. The clock had measured every second of the elapsed time. The crew had not. If you follow aviation mysteries and unexplained incidents, subscribe for future investigations.